I'm really a guy who lives out in the woods. Don't have any of those special fancy titles. But I am a father, and I want my children to live in a Christian nation. And I want my children to live in a Christian nation.
Welcome back to The Lone Bulwark. I'm Stephen Wolf. Well, as you can see, you cannot see me. So this will be audio only this time. And that's for reasons I won't disclose. But yeah, so just audio only this time. It's actually kind of nice to do it like this, to be honest. Now I can just look around. I don't have to stare at a camera. It's actually very freeing. And hopefully I can think better by doing it this way. I can also stare at my notes, which is also helpful. Well, today we're talking about the Establishmentarians. I will talk about church establishment. I also want to talk about the Establishmentarians and mainly the Establishmentarians of recent vintage. The Establishmentarians you might find in the ARP, RPCNA, and some of those people are scattered in the PCA and the OPC. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. I'm often accused of being an establishmentarian. And I'm perfectly fine with church establishment. I've never called for a confessional church state establishment at the federal level. I've never even called for one at the state level, though I'm perfectly fine with there being a church establishment at the state level. But I think we need to talk about what that even means in the first place. Like, what is a church establishment? Some people use the word soft establishment for like the New England Congregationalist establishments. And then you have like sort of hard establishment, probably exemplified in Erastian church arrangements, as you'd find in, 16th, 17th century England and other places. And so there are different forms of it, and we need to talk about what these things actually refer to. And when someone says he wants a state church, well, okay, what do you mean by that? Is that the state church that someone like John Cotton wanted, or is it the sort of state church that someone like Richard Hooker wanted, or Erastus? So what are we exactly talking about? So that's establishmentarianism. There's also the establishmentarians. Now, my beef with establishmentarians of our day is they tend to reduce all of Christian politics to that. And so when you ask them, what are your Christian politics? They'll say, well, I'm an establishmentarian. And then everything's kind of reduced to that. We ought to do that. Okay, but why ought we do that? Well, they think that it's commanded of God, absolutely, that is what we ought to pursue. I would deny that and say, actually, church establishment is really just one means to an end. The principle is that God ought to be honored within the commonwealth, and that if church establishment is necessary to meet that principle and to fulfill the end meaning that the people in general are honoring God in worship, and that requires, as a means, a church establishment, then I'm all for that. There might be certain circumstances where that actually does not work, that it does not conduce to the end of the people honoring God. You can think of an example where the established church has gone wrong, and now you have to have an independent church in order to meet that end. And that's kind of what many countries have done, from Scotland and England elsewhere. As the church has liberalized, then people have these independent churches that, of course, are disestablished or non-established in order to meet the end that people would worship God. So I see it as a means to an end. I would say in a Christian country, it is ordinarily necessary. I don't think it's absolutely necessary. And you can just take American religion, where of course there was heresy mixed in there and some bad theology. But Protestant religion flourished pretty well in the United States in the 19th century and the early 20th century. And for much of our history, and in fact, even to this day, compared to other Western countries, without an established church. So in that sense, was it necessary? Would it have been better? That's, of course, a counterfactual we can talk about. But I don't think it's absolutely necessary to have a very religious Protestant, pan-Protestant nation. I don't think it's necessary to have an established church in the midst of that. But the establishmentarians tend to, even if they make an argument that it is absolutely necessary as a means, they tend not to think of the full breadth of politics. That what is politics? Is politics just politicians making law? Well, in the classical conception of politics, politics is more thorough than that. In fact, your public life is an aspect of politics. Your business is a part of the commonwealth. Your participation in public life is a matter of politics. Your customs, even the customs that you as a people do, contributes to this public life. And so that, in a sense, is part of politics. Even if we keep the customs out of law or we don't enforce custom through law, it still is a part of our public life, and so therefore that is politics. And so politics is more than just a bunch of laws or a bunch of coercion. It's our public life together. What is that going to look like? Even the manners that we have in everyday life, you can see that as a part of our life together, as the symbiosis, as Althusius called it, in which we flourish together as a people. And that is an aspect of politics, because politics is what? It is the subject of your collective life together in a city or within a civil community. And so therefore, the breadth of it, the extent of politics is far more than just the law. And even the way in which Christianity comes to be a part of that common life, it's more than just that we share a common national church. As ideal as perhaps that might be, there's more to it than that. There's everything from prayers before sporting events. There are invocations at special events, and say in the military, we do stuff like that. There's the everyday life of assuming people have Christian morality. There's Christian customs. There are the various events throughout the year that are infused with Christianity. Perhaps they're part of a sort of religious calendar. All those things are a part of our public life together, and they go to reinforce the very end of public life, which is not only virtue, but also piety. So if you think of one principle of politics is that God ought to be honored. How do we do that? Well, the means to that would be certain laws, like Sabbath laws. It could be church establishment. It's also customs. It's also our understanding of ourselves as a Christian people. You put all that together as a sort of means, then in the end of it is you have a nation that is honoring God, right? Of course, not perfectly in a fallen world, but nevertheless, that's where it's pointed to, and it should be principally pointed towards the worship of God on the Lord's Day. Okay, so this is why church establishment matters. This is why Sabbath laws matter, because they all point towards something that is higher to a life to come, and that's what earthly life ought to be ordered to. So I just think that typically establishmentarians, when they talk about their, quote, political theology, they reduce it down to church establishment. What's often connected with that, though not always, is a postmillennialism. I've talked before about how postmillennialism, which this is not a necessary consequence of it, but it tends to provide people sort of fantastical understanding of political life, because whatever is true, or the constraints of today, the sort of conflicts that you see within the world today, let's say, mainly like ethnic conflicts or cultural clashes, those all will be done away with because everyone's converted to Christ in this post-millennial hope. And so all the problems that you see that would kind of make their political, vision fantastical and unlikely and improbable, all those constraints are done away with. And so therefore you can just sort of walk into church establishment. You get church establishment, you fulfill that absolute duty as they see it, because everyone's converted to Christ and everyone's going to church. So in the end, the actual establishment or the law or the Sabbath law, all those things that would kind of nudge or coerce people towards, virtue and piety are in effect unnecessary because everyone's converted. And more than that, you mix them in with this theonomy, and you get someone like James White. James White has this sort of fantastical view of politics because he's post-millennial theonomist. And everyone, because they're converted truly and wholly to, I guess, the Calvinistic Baptist faith, everyone will then be as advanced as he is in understanding the law, and they'll be theonomic, and then everything just organically happens to the point where it's not even clear if you need laws concerning Sabbath or blasphemy or atheism or anything at all because everyone's already converted. So essentially politics has been rendered useless because everyone is already doing what they ought to do. Now, that's not everyone. Not everyone is a, post-millennial, theonomic, whatever, ever. But that's the trajectory people tend to go down. But anyway, bringing it back, again, like church establishment itself is a means to an end, and therefore you have to take into account contingencies, circumstances to see how exactly you're going to do that. And this is why when people ask me, are you pro-church establishment? I say, yeah, generally depends on the circumstances. Like, is it and what exactly do we mean by church establishment itself? And I usually kind of just, laugh at a lot of establishmentarians, sometimes usually privately, because they reduce everything down to that one thing and they call it Christian politics, while typically assuming a lot of modern arrangements. So the idea that you can have a people in place in which the dead and living and unborn have a sort of connection because they are ancestral. The idea that you would need to have this grounding of homogenous culture, all that stuff just kind of doesn't matter at all to their politics, because in the end, a Christian politics is establishment plus a mix of a sort of postmillennialism.
I've been having a problem with my friend Ben.
That's raw Ben nationalist to you.
I'm sorry, my friend raw Ben nationalist. See, he doesn't trust those big box soap companies with all their nasty chemicals.
That's right. Gotta keep my T levels high.
Right, which has led him to do things like not shower for days at a time. But luckily, I just got some of that new Indigo Sundry soap.
Ew, keep that away from me.
No, Ben, this soap is different. It's made from all natural ingredients and none of that nasty, harmful stuff. And so now my friend Raw Ben Nationalist here.
That's Mr. Sir Reginald Ben Esquire III. Thank you very much.
So now Mr. whatever his name is can shower in confidence. And so can you if you head to indigosundrysoap.com and pick yours up today. And hey, if you subscribe to any of their bundles or soaps, you get an automatic 10% off all your orders.
Delightful.
Okay.
This is Dave. Dave is dead. When he wasn't, he was a successful businessman with a rather large estate. This is Ben. As Dave's son, Ben has just inherited a logistical nightmare. Dave wasn't exactly organized with his estate. Sorting through folders, receipts, and records, a hunting lodge in Montana, a 401k, lots of investments, several bank accounts, and of course, taxes. Ben was overwhelmed. Enter Joe Garcia, Backwards Planning Financial. When Ben called Joe and explained everything, Joe replied,
"No problem. That's easy."
And somehow it was. With Joe's guidance, Ben was able to put a robust financial plan in place which helped mitigate risk and bring order to the chaos, while building wealth, organizing his estate, easing the tax burdens, and cutting unnecessary costs. He helped Ben do something Dave never did: plan ahead. Starting at the end and working backwards, Ben now has a plan for his own family. Now his kids won't go through what he did when he eventually... Backwards Planning Financial. Start planning for your death before you're gone.
To add to that, what they often do is they conflate church and state. The church is this sort of multicultural thing, and so why can't also your civil life be this multicultural thing? We all share union in Christ. We're all spiritually united to Christ, and therefore we're all the same, and therefore we can just have a Christian society without any of those other constraints, which would be a particular way of life that is yours and is something you inherited from your ancestors. So they don't really care about a lot of that stuff. All right, so that's kind of my beef with them. Fine, I just don't think that if you're going to say you have Christian, you affirm Christian politics, therefore you're going to be establishmentarian. All right, now the other question is, what are the different types of church establishment? When someone says that Wolf wants a state church at the federal level that's confessional, okay, what do you mean exactly by a state church? First of all, if you are pro-blasphemy laws, that is, you think blasphemy should be punished through the civil sword in some by some sort of punishment, that's not an established church. That's not an established church. If you want to suppress atheism, that's not an established church. Why are you doing that? Well, it tends to be the case that people who are atheists and those who try to dishonor God in public, that tends to be detrimental to society. By the way, everyone recognized this until fairly recently. Every one of the founders recognized this, that if you publicly blaspheme God and that becomes a norm or acceptable in public life, that is detrimental to even our earthly good, right? That is detrimental because then there are, if public atheism is acceptable, then you do not get, people cannot have sincere oath taking. People cannot trust one another. Once you lose the first table, you also tend to lose the second table. So if there is no God, if the public is formally indifferent to God, then it would seem that anything goes in morality. And we've seen how our own country, as it becomes more atheistical in the sense that public life has been rendered indifferent to God, you see how morality slips, and now we have men wearing dresses in schools. So you see the trajectory. So there might be a public interest in suppressing atheism, suppressing blasphemy, but again, that's not church establishment. Even having a Sabbath law, that is a Sunday law or blue law that constrains or restricts certain types of commerce on a Sunday, that is not church establishment. You're not establishing a particular church. You're simply saying this day is set aside for rest, and by the way, you ought to go to church. But it's not telling you which church to go to. It's not formally establishing a church. But anyway, even if someone says they do want a church establishment, that can look very different and in ways that I actually would not even agree with. So let's start with probably within the Protestant world, probably you could say, I hate to use the word extreme, but it's on the extreme end of the spectrum. And that would be Erastian arrangements. So people like to throw around the idea of Erastians. A lot of times they'll equate church establishment with Erastianism, but that's not the case. So, and there are moderate versions of it too. But I think that you can, when you think of Erastian church establishment, I think the key thing to hone in on is going to be the relationship of the civil magistrate to the church. Because in the Erastian arrangement, I'd say the more typical arrangement, there might be moderates, I guess, that might say they're moderate Erastians who don't affirm this, but typically the civil magistrate, let's just call it the king or the monarch, is in some sense over the church. Over the church in this regard, in that above the king is Christ as the God-man, Christ as mediator. Okay, so this means that the civil magistrate is over the church, who himself is under Christ as mediator. So Christ is a king of the church, and below that would be the civil magistrate. Now, this is affirmed by a lot of people, particularly within Anglicanism and elsewhere, that not only that Christ is over the state as mediator, but that immediately under Christ is the civil magistrate. All right. So what this means is that the church is considered a formal part of the Commonwealth. Okay. It's a formal part of the Commonwealth in its essence, which means that the ministers act in one sense on behalf of the earthly ruler. This is, people throw around the word Caesaropapism. This is kind of that idea where the ministers then are acting on behalf of the civil magistrate, who himself is under Christ as mediator. And what this means then is that that the magistrate has a certain power over the church, not that he can administer the word, that he can minister the sacraments. It means, though, that when the ministers of the church act, they are acting by the authority of the civil magistrate. So that means the magistrate can appoint people for ordination. Even if he cannot formally ordain them, he's the one who essentially says, this man, not that man, is to be ordained. And so that man is ordained. He can say, this is the sort of thing you're going to preach on this Sunday. He can't administer the Lord's Supper, but he has a lot of power around how that is done. And then, very controversially, he would have power over who can be excommunicated, which of course can then exclude himself from excommunication. This was a kind of sort of a big controversy in Scotland, in England, places in continental Europe. What sort of powers does the church have over the civil magistrate? And so the way this was resolved, as I'll go in more detail later, was to say, sort of like for Presbyterians, it was they have no power to depose him from his civil office, but the civil magistrate as a man in the church can be excommunicated. But the Erastian position is that actually when you excommunicate, you're excommunicating by the authority of the civil magistrate. And therefore, if he says you cannot excommunicate me, then you simply don't have the authority to do it. All right. Now, that's the Erastian position. But again, it relies upon the idea that the civil magistrate is a sort of mediator. I don't know if they'd like that language, but a middleman between Christ as mediator and the church. And so they act on behalf. So then, of course, that would be, formally speaking, a state church. And why is that? Because the church literally is under the state. The state, it's a part of the commonwealth in its essence, in its form, and therefore the church itself is subordinate to the state, except for very particular things in the sense that the state officials cannot administer word and sacrament, but they can appoint for ordination, and they can restrict the use of excommunication. Now you can see the benefits of that for the civil magistrate, because if you have a church, the church then cannot meddle in politics. This is one of the reasons why a lot of people in England and Scotland did not like the Presbyterians, because the Presbyterians were more willing to say, hey, this is error, and therefore we excommunicate you. And so even though the Presbyterians would deny that they can depose in a civil sense, and they couldn't, they would deny that. Certainly if you're in a Christian state, a Christian commonwealth, and the magistrate then is excommunicated from the church, then obviously that's going to have civil effects. Even if it's not the intrinsic end of the action, which is spiritual, obviously that does give the church significant power over the civil magistrate. So the concern of the Erastians, which is a well-founded concern, even if they can't get, they can't get to the conclusion they want to in a sound way. The concern is, why does the church have this power? The church should not have this power over the magistrate, because in effect, even if not in principle or the principal effect, the secondary effect would be the loss of legitimacy within a Christian commonwealth, which is true. I think that's actually a fair concern. Even though I don't agree with their structure of how they get there. So that would be the Erastian arrangement, right? I won't go over it again, but that's what that is. Then, the next in line, I would say, would be the Presbyterian understanding of the relationship. So the Presbyterian understanding is that church and state are, in a sense, independent, or they're more independent than under the Erastian arrangement. And you can see this in Rutherford and Gillespie. And they have mutually complementary powers, but it's such that each kind of operates, for the most part, independent from one another. So the state, and this way too, I should go to the two kingdoms side of this. The state is under God as creator, or Christ as he is God, right? The church is under Christ as God-man, or as mediator. Now, I know there are some Scottish Covenanters, Presbyterians, who do affirm the idea that Christ is mediator. Christ as mediator is over the state, but we'll just bracket that off for now. But if you take like the Rutherford or Gillespie view, the state is under God as creator, and therefore they have the sort of power that the state has is purely outward and civil, right? And the power of the church is just a power spiritual. It's a church power. So what this means is that The minister as man is subject to the civil sword, and the magistrate as man is subject to the church regarding spiritual things. So that the church can excommunicate the magistrate, but that cannot depose him from civil office in effect. Like, that's not the intrinsic end of excommunication, is the removal of his civil power. That has to come from a different means, therefore the civil means. The magistrate can act upon the minister as he is a man, and even under when he acts in the appearance as a minister. So if the minister stands up there and says, hey, we need to subvert the state, we need to rebel right now, we don't like this, I'm going to organize you guys right now in my sermon in order to lead a rebellion against the state. That is something the minister is not acting as minister in that capacity. He has the appearance of it because he's wearing the robes, he's got the pulpit, he's in the church, he's got the congregation. But that act is not actually a sermon. That's not actually the word of God. You know, the preaching of the word is the word of God, but if it's not the word of God, then they're not preaching the word of God. And so therefore he's acting as a man, and therefore he can be restrained by the civil magistrate. So there are those distinctions where the church can enter in appearance into the affairs of the state, but only as a secondary effect. The principal effect would be the spiritual soul of the civil leaders. The civil leaders can enter into the church regarding errors of that church that are destructive to civil society and even the souls of the people there. So this is how they make, of course, Presbyterians are really good at their distinctions. And so this is actually my view, we have these distinctions that I think are coherent and they work out, right? So you have relative independence between the church and the state. You have a distinction of the powers between the spiritual power of the church and the civil power of the state, but they're not utterly separate from one another. The state has an interest in true religion because true religion, through piety, does elevate the state in virtue. Piety is necessary as a foundation and a perfect virtue. And so the state has an interest in religion, and therefore can act against false religion. They can act against heresy. They can act against blasphemy. They can act against atheism. They can act against false forms of worship. Why? Well, because there's a state interest in true piety. The church itself has an interest in a well-functioning state, precisely because the church has no carnal means by which to protect itself. So they can then encourage and exhort the state to act with virtue, so that the church within the context of the Commonwealth can operate freely without any sort of hindrances or without any sort of molestation from whatever heretics or whatever. And so they have an interest, but also the church has an interest in the spiritual life of even the civil leaders, because the civil leaders are in the church. Their soul, in a way, is subject to scrutiny or censorship from the ministers. And so there is that then complementary role. So in what sense is that a church establishment? Well, the church itself pre-exists the establishment of it. The magistrate cannot appoint people for ordination, nor can he control the excommunication, but he can act around it. He can protect it from heresy, all these other things, as I've already mentioned. So that's a sort of church establishment, even though the church itself is not necessarily established directly by the state, nor is the church under the state formally. The church is, in a way, in the Commonwealth, because the church is necessary for the common life of people, because piety itself supports and is a foundation of virtue. But the church, in essence, is under Christ as mediator and has a supernatural end, not a civil end. And in a way, the minister as minister is not a member of the Commonwealth, if that makes sense. And if you want more about this, you can read my chapter 1 of Reformed Christian Politics, which is coming out in book form in a couple of weeks or a week. And you can read it online at reformedchristianpolitics.org. That's the study report that Zach Garris and Sean McGowan and I put together. You can read that. That's generally my position. Anyway, that's, of course, like people would say that's a state church and whatever you want to call it that. But that's the Presbyterian form of it. And then if we're moving down the spectrum a little more, which will be the last one we cover, that would be the idea of what people might call a soft establishment. This would be the New England arrangement, New England being Massachusetts and Connecticut, with slight differences within the 16th century. And this would be the Congregationalist model. So Congregationalism itself is a form of ecclesiastical polity, but it's also you could say, a softer form of the Presbyterian model, even though I would say it's actually very, very similar. In fact, I'm trying to think if there's any essential difference between it. If someone knows an essential difference, let me know. But in this form, there still would be a protection of the church. There still would be a suppression of heresy, of blasphemy, of false forms of worship. You could, in this model, you can deny the erection of certain churches. So Baptists wanted to start a church in Boston, and the civil magistrate said no until they were forced to in the 1690s. And so, yeah, it's actually very similar now I think about it. And this is not even soft establishment, is for something else. So let me take that back a moment. So I would say in the Congregationalist system, there actually is not anything that's essentially different. So for Congregationalists, the ecclesiastical polity is that the church, the individual local church, is that which dictates who's ordained. The minister is a member of that church. Whereas in the Presbyterian form, of course, there is the presbytery, and the ministers of churches, the teaching elders of the church, of the local churches, are actually, formally speaking, members of the regional church, which is the presbytery. And of course, there's a general assembly. So you have those layers of authority, whereas in Congregationalism, everything's kind of narrowed down into the local church. And there might be sort of regional associations, but there's no formal ecclesial power that those bodies hold, unless the churches give them up under contract. But the Presbyterian form is not like that. It's more of a sort of jura divino. It's more of like a by divine law that it should be arranged that way. So anyway, there's not big difference there. But now if you think what is more properly a soft establishment, which would be the fourth way, a soft establishment, which is what you find largely within the founding period, American founding period, and afterwards for several decades, is the idea that there is a sort of favored church within the state, or you can think of the default church that is supported by the state through taxes. Everyone else, for the most part, unless it's utterly heretical and destructive, can have their own churches. They can fund them, and in most cases, the tax money you'd give to support churches would go to your church. So the soft establishment is, hey, we want to allow maximal religious liberty within our civil jurisdiction, but it would also be good if we have some kind of means of redistribution of money so that we can support ministers in places that are unable to fund their own ministers. So if you don't want a bunch of charlatans running around in the backwoods, it would be good for the state to say, well, we want some way to get these trained, educated ministers even in the backwoods of people, so people can have religion. Either they're going to have charlatans out there, or what they're going to have are no churches at all. So that's the idea of a soft establishment, the state supporting churches through resources while also permitting maximal religious liberty. And so those are, I think that was about four. Those are the four different kind of general ways in which you can think of church establishment. Now, some of those, like I'm not Erastian, I don't agree with their principles, so I don't even think those are proper. That's a proper, in itself, a lawful means of church establishment. So I would myself exclude that one. The other three, the Presbyterian one, and then I talked about the Congregationalist arrangement, and then I talked about the sort of founding period arrangement of a soft establishment. I think all three of those are lawful means in order to promote true religion within a civil community. Now, which one you choose is going to change. So just think of, it's going to be dependent upon circumstances and the contingency. So if you're in 1630 New England and nearly everyone who came over on the boat is Congregationalist and they want to establish a system of church-state relations based upon that conception of church and state, then I think it's it's very permissible for them to say, look, Baptist, I've said this before, but look, Baptist, like, you can be members of our churches, so you can hear the word, you can receive the sacraments. We can even tolerate perhaps you not baptizing your child, which they did, but we're not going to let you have your own churches. Now, why is that? Why wouldn't we want to have Baptists also have their own churches? Well, because you consider us to not be legitimately baptized. You consider our leaders to not be not even legitimately baptized, like invalid baptism. So it's not even illicit, it's invalid. So you're not even baptized. And that kind of questions whether you're Christians at all. And so then you might say that, well, our churches aren't even true churches at all because we don't actually administer baptism. Administering the sacraments rightly, or just simply administering the sacraments, is an essential condition for you to be a church. You don't even administer the sacrament, not even, again, invalidly. That is, it doesn't even have its effect as baptism. Therefore, you Congregationalists are not real churches. That was the sort of logic of the Baptists. Now, when a Congregationalist encounters that in their sort of fledgling colony, what are they going to think? Well, look, again, we don't want that sort of thing to spread because it's bad for civil public discipline. It's bad for our order. It doesn't meet our intent for this commonwealth. We established this. You came to us. We're being hospitable in the sense that you can be in our churches, but you cannot start your own. So in that time period, at that time, that makes perfect sense to me and I think is perfectly just. You fast forward to a lot more diversity of religious opinion and also experience with each other as in, we can actually get along and form a free republic with, each other. Then we're going to extend religious liberty out. But at the same time, we're going to do this thing called soft church establishment, and we're going to support the public ministry throughout our state or our county or community. That is a response to circumstances and experience to try to achieve the same end. The end for both would be a pious public, not only to the glory of God, but also to the good of the commonwealth in its own virtue and its own morality. So anyway, things change over time. So then what is suitable now is, of course, a different question than whether we can do any of those things at all. So is it permissible to do a soft establishment? I would, of course, say yes. Is it suitable for our time? I guess it depends on the location and the state. I've always said we need to start with Sabbath laws, and we need to also start with disfavoring the atheist, if not culturally, but also legally. That's the sort of thing I've said before. But of course, that is a question for the statesman. This is another distinction that is important for us to understand. What I do is political theory. Now, you might think it's a cop-out while I say I don't know what we should do now. I have, of course, ideas. But deciding what we ought to do now in actual policy is actually a very different question than whether or not we can have a church establishment. That is in principle. Is it permissible? That is the job of the political theorist. That is the job of even theologians to determine these things. What are the lawful means to a certain end? What are the lawful species of actions or laws that we can establish to achieve a certain end? That's a question of the political theorist, and it's what I try to do is I try to communicate to people who are better at the politics, who are more naturally the sort of statesmen. I try to communicate to them what are the principle and means of politics. Yes, one of those means can be this. That is church establishment. That is, yes, suppression of atheism, Sabbath laws. Those are lawful means to achieve the end of a pious republic. So you now have to then contend in politics to achieve these things. You are better at that than me, so go and do it. I'm going to be on the side of defending your right to do it. And maybe I can do both, but at least in my role now, that is my role. So that is that. Those distinctions. Let's see. Now, what I want to move to now is the conception that is of church-state relations that's common within, I say, NAPARC in general. which is probably best articulated by the modern Two Kingdoms guys. Now, I think their theology is incoherent and also destructive. Nevertheless, I do think that their articulation of it is probably the best that they have. And that is that the civil government is just purely, entirely concerned with human natural things. And more than that, they have no cognizance or any principled cognizance. That is, the civil ruler, as civil ruler, cannot factor in the gospel, cannot factor in supernatural theology, or even in many cases, and even natural theology, into their political reasoning. This is certainly supernatural theology is the case, and best I can tell from their writing is that even when it comes to God existing, that is the God of creation, natural theology, or what concerns the first table of the law, think of the first commandment, worship God only, none of those are a factor in your political reasoning. And so this precludes right off the bat church establishment, because the church itself is a supernatural institution, and therefore knowledge that this church is truly supernatural in itself is outside of the bounds of political reasoning for the civil magistrate. So they can't even know in principle, when acting as magistrate, that this church is the church of God, right? So they cannot then, in their political thinking of how to act or the political actions they take, they have no cognizance of whether this or that religious assembly, whether it's a Hindu temple or a Christian church or a Buddhist temple or a Scientology church, they have no ability in principle to discern which one is of the true God and which one is not. That is their starting point there. Now, this tends to lead to several problems. One of those problems would be it seems to divide up the revelation of God into two sort of incommensurable orders of truth. So you've got the truth of nature and the truth of supernature. So you have natural truth and supernatural truth, and those tend not to align within political reasoning. One of the things I have argued is that if civil government ought to promote true religion, and Christianity is the true religion, therefore the civil government ought to promote Christianity. That assumes two things that actually they strangely reject. One of the things they have to reject is the idea, first of all, that you can make that sort of syllogism. That is, that you can have a principle of nature and a principle of a supernatural statement or truth statement in a sort of syllogism like that. That would be classically called a mixed syllogism. People do it in theology all the time. In fact, it's necessary for Orthodox theology, that is small o Orthodox theology, because, like saying Christ is fully man assumes that fully man is univocally associated with what we mean naturally by fully man, right? So that term, fully human, is a term that's in a way borrowed from nature to make that statement, Christ is fully man, right? It's univocal in the sense that it means the same thing. The referent of it is the same. So it's necessary in Orthodox theology to make that sort of move. That actually, what the statements of supernatural theology and the statements of natural truth share terms univocally, right? That's essential for us to have a proper doctrine of Christology. I would say there's nothing in principle, and in fact, every reason to say that within politics is the same thing. So you can have natural principles of political order, and then if supernatural truth shares a term univocally with natural truth, then that could potentially form a syllogism in which one of the terms would be supernatural. That is, so again, it would be civil government ought to promote true religion. I would say that's a natural truth. They would deny that, but we'll get to that in a second. Civil government ought to promote true religion. That's a natural statement. Christianity is a true religion. That is a supernatural statement because Christianity, that term, is supplied is a supernatural term. That is it's part of the body of truth revealed by God as Redeemer. But the word true religion is still a term of the natural order. Okay, so you got the subject term is Christianity, the predicate term is true religion. That word true religion is shared by a principle of nature. Therefore, you could put that together and do a therefore. You can have a conclusion. The conclusion is civil government ought to promote Christianity. Okay? So when you come to that conclusion, it is theological in a sense because it's taking a term of revealed theology. Nevertheless, what you're doing is you're just further specifying the middle term. You're saying what true religion is. And so if you apply those to that principle, given a unified order of truth that is not separated as natural and supernatural, but brought together as one reality, then you're going to get the conclusion that civil government ought to promote Christianity. In fact, only Christianity. So anyway, that is one important step that I think the modern two kingdom guys miss. And again, I think it requires them to separate natural truth and supernatural truth into separate orders of truth, two realities that are incommensurable. That is, they are not something in which you can form reasoning or syllogisms based on those. The other things that they would do is they would just deny that civil government has that first principle that I mentioned. That is, civil government ought to promote true religion. Now that might seem natural enough. That is, nowadays people are ready to accept that is deny that. They would deny that civil government ought to promote true religion. But what this means in the end is that civil society is formally indifferent to God. That is, civil society itself, if the ordering agent of a society has no cognizance or has no interest in itself, cannot by its own powers promote religion, then that means that the order that the agent is ordering doesn't essentially need God. That is, the worship and acknowledgement of God in order for it to achieve its end. Civil society then is reduced to nothing but, modern life, which is calling balls and strikes in a very minimal level in human interaction. So there's no thick conception of the good that we are sharing as a common life. It's simply a procedural sort of politics. That is, there is under a minimal requirement of action. So we're not called to be virtuous. In civil society, there's no expectation of a common virtue. There's no expectation of a common morality or a common way of life. It's all just, what is it? Just liberalism. It's an individualistic conception. You get to define your truth and the meaning of the universe. That is not simply where we've landed as a fact. That is the very requirement of the modern two kingdom approach. It requires that sort of thing, right? So what this means then is not only is virtue dropped out. They might have they might prefer that there's virtue and piety in the Commonwealth, but the civil magistrate who is the agent to order this thing is not called to promote piety and not called to promote some sort of unified virtue. So therefore, our common life together in a community does not require, as per its own principles, as per its own end, as per its own nature, does not require for its basic health, does not require any sort of public acknowledgement of God. That is, by its nature, civil society, if you just treat it as something, abstract it from, your civil society or whatever, abstract it, just treat it as a thing itself, and you're trying to consider it by its nature, what are its principles, what are its ends, what does it need to actually have basic life or exist and sustain itself, one of the principles is not piety. And again, it's not even virtue. It's just procedural justice under minimal requirements of a very fundamental human morality. Don't harm someone else. You're free to kind of think and be whatever you want as long as you don't harm someone else in the act of doing it or restrain someone in their pursuit of the meaning of their own universe. So even if we take, let's say it is like a classical conception where it really is just virtue. Virtuous acts in an earthly sense, liberality, courage, moderation, those sorts of things. Even if we want to have a stronger conception of the state, so if modern 2K guy wants to say, yeah, we should have virtue, that's good. That should be promoted by the civil government. They still want to say, however, that piety is itself not an essential ingredient of that. That is, virtuous action does not require, in general, and for a population, there to be any sort of formal recognition to God. You can have a virtuous society that maintains itself as such with being formally indifferent to the true God. In fact, formally indifferent to religion in general. So there's no gods, there's no sort of spiritual realm, there's no true God. The civil society is formally indifferent to that. That's what it requires. So if you reject the principle, civil government ought to promote true religion as a natural principle, then you are rejecting then the necessity of piety for the health, for as a foundation and for the perfection of civil society. Which means, again, that the state and civil society can be formally indifferent to God, even though he created it. That's what this leads to. Now, one of the issues with that, even if you might say that's coherent, which I don't think it is in itself, but even if you want to say it's coherent, there are problems there then with human anthropology, right? Because what are we? Our being, our actual being in itself, even at the individual level, we don't separate our moral life from our pious life. That is, our duties to God are not formally separated from our duties to fellow man or our virtue in society. Our piety and virtue are not separate things. It's true that piety is directed upward to God. But are you telling me that action of the upward action of looking to heaven has no effect upon our earthly life? I mean, in this sense, they're separating earthly life and heavenly life such that us pursuing heavenly life has no necessary, It has no necessary effect upon forming our earthly life. That is kind of that's what this entails. Now, they would say that at the individual level, yes, piety does promote virtue at the individual level. Okay. But if society itself requires good order, if society itself as a formal unit, as a collective of people, requires in itself for people to have a virtuous citizenry, a moral citizenry, in order for society to achieve its end, even an end of good order, discipline, and virtue, then that means that the state must have an interest in piety. Because the state, or say the civil magistrate, is interested in promoting, let's just say, absolute end would be virtue, but virtue requires piety. Therefore, the state must have some sort of interest in piety in order to achieve its own intrinsic end. If its own intrinsic end is virtue requires piety, then the state must, by necessary consequence, have some sort of interest in the promotion of piety. If you deny that they have any interest in the promotion of piety, then it means you are, the second, third order effects of that is you're separating virtue and piety. Or you could just say that the state has no interest in virtue either. It's simply just a procedural thing of calling balls and strikes as to whether this action harms some other person, which is liberalism. That's, I think, being shown clearly today to be a deficient understanding of civil society itself. Anyway, if that made any sense, I sure hope it did. But my central point is this. Within the human person, you cannot separate piety and virtue. Virtue is directed primarily to the interests of us in this earthly life. Piety is directed to our interests as it pertains to heavenly life, to God in heaven. So there are two directions. There are two different intrinsic ends. One is to give glory to God immediately. One is to immediately promote a good, to live well in this world. Of course, immediately that gives glory to God, but piety immediately gives glory to God. And our civil life, if good, immediately, that is through the action of our actions on earth, give glory to God. But those two things are not separate. They're required for the whole person. The whole person is one whose life is oriented to the glory of God in piety, and that piety has the effect of ordering our virtues. If we don't have the piety, ordinarily, given for the human person, you're going to have disordered virtue. Now, there can be cases where you have very virtuous people who are not pious at all. You can have very virtuous atheists. You can have very virtuous pagans. I don't deny that. But in general, most people are average. In general, most people are like most people. And most people in general require a piety in order to order their virtues. Certainly, we've seen individuals in our own churches who have lived horrible lives of drug abuse and other things, other vices. They come to Christ, and guess what? They're transformed and changed, and they leave all those vices behind. So given that anthropology, and given the fact that civil society is an ordering of individuals formally for the common good, that is, you're ordering actions in civil life for the common good, which in the end leads to the good life for individuals as well. But that's ethics. In terms of politics, ordering the life of a community in acts to the common good, then piety is a necessary ingredient of that. Piety is a necessary ingredient such that it orders the virtues of a public life. So you need public piety in order to have public morality, have public virtue. And again, so that's the major deficiency of modern kingdom theology. And by the way, everyone affirmed some form of what I already said. When George Washington says that religion is indispensable to civil society, to morality, that is what he's talking about. He's saying religion is necessary because religion relates to morality as something that supports as the higher supports what is lower. You know, piety is directed to God. The secondary effects of that is it orders our virtue for earthly life. That's what George Washington's saying. Even someone like James Madison would say that. Now, James Madison denied church establishment, but as I've talked about already, you don't have to have church establishment in order to have a Christian nation. You don't have to have a church establishment in order for a community to be ordered in piety, ordered to piety. It's not required. And so everyone believed this. Even the 19th century Presbyterians who denied church establishment, they all believed that religion was necessary for a flourishing civil society. Not because religion directs civil society, not because pastors are going to dictate policy, not because they are the mobilizers of social action, but because when you order yourself to God in heaven, it orders the rest of your being. And so that is why religion is necessary, indispensable, as Washington said, for a virtuous and moral society. Everyone believed this until very recently, until what? The Warren Court said, actually, we are a secularist society and religion cannot appear anywhere by any sort of governmental dictation. And so because we've grown up in that, because in our socialization over the last several decades, that is what we have come to assume. And then you have people interpreting the American founding, I would say anachronistically, through that lens and saying, actually, this is what they intended all along. They intended there to be Hindu temples in the middle with statue to Hindu warrior gods. They intended that something like that, or at least wanted to permit that, it would just be a great thing if we had a diverse society of various religions, and that would be great, and they would just love the way that things have turned out regarding religion. No, of course they'd be horrified. No one believed that until recently. And so what do you have then? You have we're socialized into a political way of thinking. You read the tradition, and you read it in sort of scattered ways. You read the original Westminster Confession, which has very strong language for the civil magistrate, and then you think this is kind of our tradition. What do? Well, what people have done is they have, even those who are very serious about looking into the tradition and taking seriously what it says, they have modified it into a sort of two-kingdom theology, which checks off all of the priors, every single box that you need in order to be a good sort of modern conservative. They've checked off every box on that and shown to their minds that this is the logic of the Reformation. This is the logic of the gospel. This is the logic of natural law. This is the logic of the totality of the political thought of our tradition. Of course, that is absolutely absurd for the reasons I've given, and also the reasons and other reasons as well. No one believed that. I mean, the whole idea that you have, okay, civil government or politics concerns or pertains to the law of nature. That's a quote from Bartholomew Keckerman. Politics pertains to the law of nature. Well, the law of nature is human. That is, it's universal. It applies to each person. Okay. Does that mean logically that civil society, it has to be just purely human? It cannot be Christian because it's natural? I've already shown through the mixed syllogism that's not the case. No one actually believed that. Everyone thought that, of course, civil government has an interest in religion, because religion is necessary for good civil government, for good civil society. Everyone affirmed that. So anyway, it just leads to all these problems, and we should not buy into that. At the same time, I will criticize, I guess, my own side, even though a lot of them don't like me. I'll criticize the guys who want to jump back and look at Calvin's Geneva and look at the original Westminster Confession of Faith and say, we should be doing that now. And so they have the podcasts, and then they have all the things they're saying. They preach about it. They have no sense of politics at all. They think just like shouting into the void, you're going to accuse me of doing this, but shouting into the void is enough for any of these things to happen. And so they just say that, well, in the end, it's just our political action is simply the gospel. If we want to have a Christian political society, we should each one of us just preach the gospel. Those are our great Christian political acts, is preaching the gospel. Now, of course, I'm not saying don't preach the gospel. I'm not saying that we don't evangelize. I'm saying there's more to politics, and actually politics in itself is different than our theorizing about it and also our preaching about it. It requires people doing political work that is very different than what I do and what any theologian does or any pastor does ordinarily. We need people doing that sort of thing. Politics happens because of action. Politics happens because people have power. People have public legitimacy. People can act and others follow. That is different than you giving a sermon. That is different than what I'm doing now in a podcast. We need people doing that. People wonder why I said Christian prince. Well, because a prince is someone people follow. It's not a policy wonk. It's not some dude who can talk about philosophy all day. It's about someone who can act, someone who can create a sort of following to make things happen and to act in politics. So we need to stop thinking that let's just take, some era of history, that we're going to take some, 1640s England and Scotland, which was, of course, even then a mess. And we're just going to say that's our Christian politics. We look around, see that that's not happening. And so then, we adopt postmillennialism, or I don't know, we say that it's just going to be all in the providence of God, and we don't actually do the politics. And by the way, and then the people who do the politics, who are kind of rough around the edges, are then criticized. Yeah, so we need to cut that out. Again, distinguish between political philosophy and politics on the ground, distinguish between political theology and political theory and other things, distinguish your gospel proclamation from the politics on the ground. All those things are connected together. All those things form as a totality, a unified whole. But in doing that, in all those other things, we cannot dismiss, we cannot disregard the need to actually do politics on the ground, organize and fight and struggle, and see politics as something that's not going to go away. I've said before that the tendency among many people nowadays is to try to come up with some system to disregard or to overcome politics itself. I know I've been beaten up on postmillennialism, but that is what often happens among postmillennials. Not all, of course, not all. It's also libertarians do this as well. Libertarians want to avoid politics by having antecedent limitations on what you can lawfully do in politics. Essentially reducing politics down to almost nothing at all. That is a philosophical form of trying to escape political life. People do it too when they say, I want church establishment, but then they have no consideration. They call you racist because you don't want to have even legal immigration. They call you racist for this and that. Or they say you love civil power too much. Yes, you should allow the temple to the Hindu warrior god because it would be wrong and unwinsome for us to say they can't have it. In the end, they want to escape political life itself. Either they appeal to providence in a sort of cyclical sort of way. Well, things are bad now, but in God's providence, it'll get better. And so they attack action through that. Or you become postmillennial and say that actually we don't need a robust politics for the here and now, precisely because in providence we're promised something that's higher and can escape all of the sort of constraints that you might see nowadays. And so that should be our politics. All right. Well, I can continue rambling on about this, but at this point I'm going to stop and I'm going to say, wish you all well. Hopefully next week, I will be able to show you my face on the video. But for now, I'll just leave it here. Thank you for listening, and bye-bye.